Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today on the August New Works Project Digital Communities. We're thrilled to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Olivia Meadows, with us today to discuss teaching some extended clarinet techniques through repertoire. But before we dive in, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the New Works Project. For those of you who may be tuning in for the first time, New Works Project is a nonprofit organization that enables musicians to participate in the commissioning of new music at a pretty accessible price. Through lowering financial barriers and increasing representation, we're really trying to promote equity in commissioning and performing new music. And it's our vision to sort of lead in creating an inclusive music community by providing access and support and various opportunities to individuals, from all backgrounds, which I think is really important. I know for me, it's become a really huge new passion as I expect to see kind of an evolution in the way we think about traditional performer composer collaboration. So thanks again for joining us. We're excited to offer these programs for free, by the way, but we do ask if you're in a position to donate, that you do support us, as a young nonprofit organization in a time of crisis, especially. We do truly rely on your support right now. So thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to officially welcome Dr. Olivia Meadows. How you doing, Olivia?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm doing very well. It's truly our pleasure to have you. It's especially nice to see you because, of course, you used to be in Hawaii here as well, and it's been a little bit since we've seen you, so it's great to catch
Yeah.
up. I'm really excited to talk about this because one of the things when we think about new music, we're always, at least for me, I'm always thinking to myself, well, what techniques is it going to have that I'm not going to be able to do or that I'm going to have to practice a lot, right? And so I can't wait to get into that. But before we do that, I'd like to just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and just give all the viewers a general idea of who you are and what you're about.
Yeah. I grew up in Florida and, spent my whole life there. My family is from New York, so a little bit of back and forth. I went to Florida State University. My we just met each other, Dr. Deborah Bish and Dr. Frank Kowalski before he retired. And then I went to Arizona State University for my master's and my doctorate back to back with Dr. Spring and Dr. Gardner out there. I was their TA while I was working out there. I was working in school of music admissions. You might know ASU is a really big new music school. So that's what kind of got me interested in this topic in particular. Since then, my husband joined the Navy, just like your wife Lily, and so that's what brought us to Hawaii. That's where our paths crossed. And then last year, right before the pandemic, we moved to Maryland for a permanent job change for my husband. So yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride. But in between there, I got to go to a lot of Clarinet Fest conventions and got to, learn a lot of great music, meet a lot of great people. So yeah, so far so good.
Great. Yeah. In case anyone missed that first part, you broke up a little bit, at least on my end. So you went to Florida
Okay.
State for your undergrad,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
went to Florida State for one of my graduate degrees, well, my only graduate degree. And so we have a connection there for
Yeah.
sure. We have some. We were never there at the same time, but we do
We
have
just
some.
missed each other.
Yeah, we did. And then Arizona State for a couple of degrees. So great schools, great teachers, great pedagogy. And I know as a clarinetist in this community that you studied with people who are really fantastic teachers on really the whole spectrum and performers for that matter, right? So,
Yeah.
you mentioned Dr. Kowalski, of course, and Dr. Bish at Florida State. So you're getting some really great training on a wide variety of stuff, right? And then, of course, Arizona State, which I think is maybe one of the most well-known, at least clarinet schools for the type of techniques and things that we're going to discuss today. So I know in comparison for me, a lot of my early education was focused mostly on the more traditional clarinet repertoire. Even on my stand right now is, music from the 19th century, kind of at the latest. So I guess I'm just curious, were you exposed to sort of, new music, 21st century music earlier on in your education, and how did that come about?
That's a great question. I definitely was exposed to it later than I now, do with my own students. I played some new music, some 21st century music, nothing with extended techniques until I got to graduate school. I'd heard some new music with extended techniques, mostly pieces by Eric Mandat, if I'm remembering correctly, in my undergrad, but they were typically at graduate recitals. So in my head at the time, I was thinking this is music for later. This is music for people who know more or are more experienced, have better technique. And then when I went to graduate school, I kind of realized that doesn't have to be the case. And I was really kind of thrown into the deep end with regards to extended techniques, not necessarily contemporary music, because I think we often confuse contemporary music with music that has extended techniques when they're not mutually exclusive. You can have one without the other and vice versa. But yeah, I was definitely thrown into the deep end and just kind of had to figure it out. And I, at the time, didn't feel adequately prepared to learn these new and very, to me, alienating techniques. And I think that's what started the spark of wanting to do this type of project, do this type of research, even though that came years later, 4+ years after I started graduate school. I think that kind of, that was the spark for this whole project.
Well, that's really cool to hear. And I think you make a really excellent point about contemporary versus extended techniques, right? When we think about contemporary music, at least for me, I'm thinking about a time period. I'm thinking about the present. I'm thinking about our literal contemporaries, right? People that are alive now or recently and that kind of thing, right? But when we talk about extended techniques, and this, by the way, doesn't just apply to clarinet, which I think is really fitting that we're having this discussion. This goes for other instruments as well. But can you personally identify some specific extended techniques, right? Because that's not the same thing as contemporary, like you said. We're talking about actual things you do on the clarinet. So what kind of extended techniques are we talking about?
So typically, at the very basic level, we're talking about things that are outside of what we consider standard technique. Standard technique being, semitones, scalar patterns, things like that. That are typically found in traditional, classical, romantic repertoire. Extended techniques basically means everything else. And that can be as simple as a glissando, like in Rhapsody in Blue. It can be as complicated as, demi clarinets, where you split your clarinet in half and you've got two mouthpieces and you're playing each half or maybe both halves at the same time. And in the case of the music that I've commissioned, what I'm focusing most on is multiphonics, meaning multiple pitches produced simultaneously, and microtones, which are, a lot of people get microtones and quarter tones confused, but a microtone is any pitch smaller than a semitone. So it's not specifically quarter tones, it can be any pitch smaller than a semitone. And I chose to focus on those two techniques kind of specifically because they're, I think, personal opinion, the easiest to understand. They're not very abstract. They're produced relatively easily in comparison to standard clarinet technique, with just you change your finger. And, once you figure it out, you can just kind of add it into your tool belt of technique. So yeah, extended techniques, it can mean so many different things, but at a very basic level, it's just anything outside of what we consider or is considered standard clarinet technique. Or not, and you're right, it's not specific to clarinet, but yeah.
And I think the other good point to mention, all great points. You're absolutely right. Those are the things I consider extended techniques, basically everything else, right? But I kind of find that the idea of extended techniques is sort of starting to mesh with traditional techniques, right? Like, so I think maybe
Absolutely.
in, I don't know how many years, but maybe in 20 years or so, I would say probably less, things
Yeah,
like
yeah,
multiphonics, that's not going to be considered necessarily extended techniques. That's going to be, I would imagine, a part of our training, right? Same with some of the
absolutely.
other things. So I'm curious, do you see, maybe of course in the universities that you came from, but do you see others or maybe an increase in teachers teaching these techniques as a more standard approach? Like, hey, if you're going to be a clarinet player, you got to know these things, and we're going to start learning from the get-go.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that you made, that it's heading in a direction where these things are going to be much more standardized. And I do see that a lot more, I think. Um, I don't know. I mean, all the students I worked with as a graduate teaching assistant at ASU were being introduced to extended techniques from the beginning, basically. They might wait a semester. It really kind of depends on the student. And that goes for pretty much anything with regards to technique and the music to which you or that you introduce a student to. But yeah, I think that I'm definitely seeing it incorporated a lot more. I definitely think that a lot of people are of the mindset that you need to be able to do these things. I think the repertoire also demands it now. I think the changing environment of classical music in general is going to demand it even more as moving forward. Um, I do think that there are basic uh, quote unquote standard technical things that make it easier to understand and produce certain extended techniques. If you don't have a great fundamental understanding of voicing, it's going to be a little bit harder to play multiphonics. Or it might be easier to play multiphonics, but it's going to be harder than to get accurate voicing on maybe standard semitonal pitches. So I think there in some students' cases it can be introduced a little bit too early, maybe. But that being said, just like with anything in teaching, if you go on a student by student basis, I definitely think it's being incorporated a lot earlier on in people's educations. And I think that's just going to increase definitely as we move forward.
I would agree with that. And you mentioned that when you got to Arizona State, students were being introduced to these concepts at a pretty early stage, right? So I was going to kind of ask you, and maybe you've partially answered it, but really, when or where did you sort of identify this gap that we're about to discuss in terms of unaccompanied pieces and extended techniques? Was it sort of before you got to Arizona State? Was it when you got there and you saw, wow, these students are learning this stuff, but I don't see this happening everywhere else? Did you get thrown in the fire and you're like, crap, I have to figure this out? How did that, how did you identify that, and when and where was that?
Yeah, a little bit of all of the above, definitely the latter. They kind of, I mean, not to throw my teachers under the fire, love you guys. But they just handed me a piece of music and they were like, okay, learn this piece. And I was like, I don't know how to do any of this. I am so unprepared. And there were things that I was able to figure out very quickly. Like I said, some things are just a matter of learning new fingerings. And there were things that I couldn't figure out until years later, when I had, breakthrough moments with regards to my voicing or something else I was doing that maybe wasn't really helping me produce these sounds. So it was early on the initial impotence for the project, and what made me realize that there's a space between, a lot of us have played the Osborne Rhapsody, which has no extended techniques, but is contemporary music. I don't know if we can continue to call it contemporary as we're now in the 2020s. But there's a big gap between that and then like the music of Eric Mandat or Bill Smith, which is hard left turn, right? So, it didn't feel like when I started learning this music. Now, of course, I've been researching this a bit more. So at the time, it felt like it was this huge space between them. And there is a little bit more repertoire between there. It's just not that well known, or maybe it's not useful for pedagogy, which is absolutely possible. I do think that there are pieces that are great that are just not the most useful for teaching techniques, or if that's what you're looking for. And yeah, and I saw a lot of students who, maybe didn't have the strongest technique, but had a real interest in learning these types of extended techniques, that easier pieces that incorporated these things would have been really, really useful for. And, when pieces are hard, it can feel really intimidating, really confusing. I kind of wanted to help create something that would kind of amplify while also teaching, rather than kind of making people feel badly about themselves or as they're working on their technique.
Man, this is powerful for me because I think about my experience, and I have to say that the more I reflect on my education, the more grateful I am for having just really great teachers who pushed me and didn't give up. On the flip side of that, like you said, maybe the teachers were teaching us what we needed at the time, right? What maybe techniques. So for example, maybe I didn't introduce myself or get introduced to multiphonics because, hey, I got to learn some basic technique stuff first, right?
Yeah.
So that's really important. But I will say, like most things in music, there's not usually one singular goal, right? For example, even just doing something like long tones. Okay, well, long tones, which I don't do, and I probably should, but there are a lot of
You
benefits to
should.
that. Yeah, I should, and I recommend everybody watching, play long tones, right? But you can say long tones are for air support, embouchure stability, right?
Mhm.
Intonation. Make sure you know all of these different things, and that one exercise will translate into so many
Yeah.
other aspects. So when you talk about the Osborne piece. Clarinet players will know this. Bassoon players will also know this because it was written for them originally. But the Osborne Rhapsody, one of my favorite pieces, right? Of course, my first unaccompanied piece that I'd ever performed. I even used it for college entrances, right? Most clarinet players know this piece. But
Yep.
I imagine now, what about a version of Osborne Rhapsody that had some sort of extended technique, right? And this leads
Yep.
me directly into what you're doing. So I
Mhm.
want to ask you specifically, can you talk a little bit about specifically your project, what you did, and how your pieces go from one technique to the next technique, maybe ending in a culmination of all those techniques?
Yeah. So I I think one of the most intimidating things to me as somebody who was just beginning to learn extended techniques was the fact that most of the pieces I encountered when I was first being introduced to them had a lot of different extended techniques. And to me, that was extremely intimidating. And it's one of those things where I just was trying to avoid it. I wanted to avoid it as long as I could because it felt so intimidating to me. And fortunately, I wasn't in a position where I could avoid, which ended up being very good for me. But I think a lot of people will understand that feeling with any given music. There's a lot of pieces. I mean, you could feel that way about the Nielsen. Really intimidating piece as well. So I wanted to create something that was maybe not intimidating, but significantly less so. So I commissioned 5 pieces, and 4 of them each focus on a technique. Not all of them focus on an extended technique, but the first 4 focus on one thing. So we have one piece focusing on rubato. So it's in the style of the Osborne Rhapsody, but uh, as a lot of us might know, that piece is an excellent piece of music. It is extremely overplayed. I heard it, I'd hear it 10 times in one semester in studio class. And I was like, I never want to hear this piece again. And I'm sure a lot of you guys can identify with that sentiment. So I wanted to create something that could kind of have teach the same effect, the written in rubato, the written in musicality, help students understand how important those things are without having to play the same piece over and over again. The next piece focuses on extending the altissimo range, which is another thing that I wasn't really told specifically to do in my undergraduate. It's pretty standard for us to go up to G6 on the clarinet to grad school, and they were like, so I wanted to create something that would be more than an etude, something that you could perform for a jury or a recital that would, in a convenient kind of simplified way that's a little more fun than scales, but still uses a lot of scalar patterns, help extend the range beyond G6. I think I could go into it for hours, but there's another break up there. Going over that other break is kind of what this piece focuses on. The next piece focuses on microtones, specifically only microtones. The next piece focuses only on multiphonics. And then the final piece kind of incorporates a little bit of everything. And that's where you get a taste of what the rest of the repertoire is kind of like, where you have a little bit of multiphonics, a little bit of microtones. You've got that. And you have to be able to put all those things together. You have to be able to play it's like baby steps kind of learning extended techniques, but in a fun way that you can still use for performances or juries and things like that.
Man, this is what I need. I mean, this is the thing. You know, for me, I'm not ashamed to admit that I have a lot of weaknesses, right? And I think that for me, my major weakness is I often gravitate towards what's comfortable. Like you said, sometimes things can be intimidating. Yeah. I agree. But part of being, I think being a successful musician in terms of growing yourself and your abilities, if that's your desire, is getting out of your comfort zone, right? Nothing, basically for me, in my opinion, all of the best things happen outside of my comfort zone. But it might be easier to transition out of that comfort zone to then eventually make that comfortable rather than just splitting, immediately right off. So I'm curious with these pieces. Of course, I've watched you've done these lectures, you've performed these pieces. Anybody can go on YouTube right now and just search your name, and they'll find, you did a recent performance of this on the Clarinet Fest, Virtual Clarinet Fest channel. There's one on the Woodwind Fest. I mean, it's out there, and I really highly recommend people searching it out. But I'm curious, do you see these pieces performed as like a recital set? Do you see them performed sort of on their own? Do you see them more as teaching tools? Is it all of the above or part of that? How do you see this going forward being performed?
For me, it's absolutely 100% all of the above. And I have personally, I mean, I know I'm a little bit biased, but I've personally used them for all of those things already. I personally perform them as a set, as a recital set. It's a little bit of a lengthy recital, depending on how much you talk. Sometimes I kind of go on for a while, so it can be a bit long. But they can definitely be performed as a recital. I, in my dissertation, recommend starting with the piece called Of Moons and Meadows, which is the one that was written in the same vein as the Osborne Rhapsody. And then moving into the piece with altissimo register called Rope's Course. And then either the multiphonics piece called Soliloquies or the microtones piece, which is called My Own Thoughts. And then finally, the piece that includes all of the techniques, which is called Winter Fantasy. And in my dissertation, I kind of say that if you're going to learn them as a set, the only real hard and fast rule I would suggest is to do Winter Fantasy last, because it has a little bit of everything. That being said, they can absolutely be performed on their own. If you have a student who's doing great with so many things, but their altissimo registers just could use a little bit of work, you can just use that one piece. I think that's one of the things that I am most proud of about this set of music is that it can be used in so many different ways. I think it's an amazing teaching tool because of the way the composers incorporated these techniques. I was really lucky to work with great composers, and I'm just really happy with how they came out and that they can be used in so many different ways. They're such versatile pieces of music. And, at the end of the day, I have to say, I think they're enjoyable to play and enjoyable to listen to, which is another thing that is not always the case for contemporary music. So, yeah, I think to that's a long-winded answer to your question, which is all of the above, definitely.
Yeah, you mentioned being excited to work with these composers, and of course, especially with the New Works Project, one of the things we focus on is trying to build relationships with composers and the musicians that are going to be performing their pieces. And I'll talk a little bit later about one of the commissions we have by another friend of mine, Luke Ellard. But I'm curious, can you talk just a little bit more in detail about actually building a relationship with the composer? Do you tell them, here's what I want in a piece, go do it? What kind of collaboration is involved? And was this a new thing for you to reach out to composers and ask, about this, or have you already been involved? Were you already involved in commissions beforehand?
I think one of the things that I loved most about studying at ASU is that both Bob Spring and Josh Gardner are really heavy into commissioning new music, performing new music. And so they set a really great example for me and my peers with regards to commissioning new music. They really encouraged it. They encouraged us to reach out to composers. Not only that, ASU has a really strong composition studio, and they would have students, friends of mine in the studio, perform pieces on the composition studio recitals. So when I started out this project, I had a small budget. I was a graduate student. I was about to get married and move to the island. I finished my research and my dissertation remotely while we were living in Hawaii. So I knew that I was going to have some complications. So, with that in mind, I had reached out to a composer previously with a friend of mine. My friend Wenwu and I play as a duo sometimes, and we had secured a commission for the 2019 Clarinet Fest. So it wasn't my first time speaking with composers. That being said, I knew that I had a lot of limitations, and I also had a time constraint. I really had a deadline in mind that I wanted to graduate by a certain date. And there's a lot of deadlines when you're working in the doctoral system. So I reached out to them, and I was very transparent with them. And I would highly recommend this to anybody who's looking to commission music. Just be really transparent about what you're looking for. I approached each composer saying, I'd like you, if you're interested, to work with this specific technique. I know that your background you have some experience with this. I contacted composers who I knew had composed for clarinet before, and in some cases composed with extended techniques before, which I think is really big. If you're working with someone who's never worked with these techniques, it's a much more involved process, which of course is also fine. But in this case, I knew it would be complicated. There was a lot of composers to juggle along with the research element. So I was trying to be really smart about the composers that I was going to work with, and the music that I was looking for. I also was very transparent about my budget, or lack thereof. I worked with a few students because I knew that this was something that would also help them. I didn't think it would get quite as much exposure as it has, and I'm so grateful for that. And I'm also grateful that I can give back to the composers in that way. But also I knew, they have to write music for their degrees as well. So I thought it might be a mutually beneficial partnership in those respects. And then I knew that I wanted to secure one, quote unquote, big name composer, if not more. I have a few, I think, but and so that's why I ended up contacting Eric Mandat to compose one of them. And it was a relatively collaborative process. I was very much able to, write to the composers and be like, this isn't quite working. In most cases, I didn't have to, though I will say the piece, My Own Thoughts, is, I think, the hardest, and definitely went back and forth with Kurt Mellenbacher a few times about some parts of it that I was like, this is just too difficult. And he was so understanding. And I think in the end, actually quite happy that I was as involved as I was. And I think that's really important. You have to really, if you're going to commission music, you really need to be invested in the music that you are creating, even if you're not the one writing, performing it, and promoting it. And I think that if you're not invested, then it might not be worth it. So That was a bit long-winded as well. Hopefully that answered your question, but it was a pretty collaborative process. I would definitely recommend being really transparent about your goals, your budget, your time constraints, everything, even the nitty-gritty things that might be a little bit uncomfortable to talk about. And that way nobody is offended, hurt, or confused about anything. And that's definitely what we want.
You made some great points there. And one of the things you mentioned, first off, really cool to be able to work with a composer and say, hey, look, this isn't quite working, especially if they're not a clarinet player, maybe not familiar with all the techniques, right? One of the things that I get excited about, once again, sort of a shameless plug, is, New Works Project is working with, again, my friend and colleague, Luke Ellard. We went to school together at Indiana University. And Luke is a really fantastic clarinetist. And so we have a really fantastic clarinetist writing an unaccompanied solo clarinet piece for clarinet. So for me, what's exciting about that is, and when you get to work with a composer on a one-on-one level, is that the piece is going to be something that is accessible, most likely, right? It's going to actually probably get played because people may not be shied away from it as much. But especially in your case, you're actually saying, hey, look, this is part of, or can be part of a pedagogical or educational experience. So tackling this is more than just a sort of musical goal, right? It's also, an educational goal and goals outside of that to grow you as a musician. So I have to ask you, for viewers and listeners that are watching and like, man, this sounds really cool. Maybe they're a performer and they want to learn these techniques. Maybe they're a teacher and they want to incorporate it into their studio. Where can we get this music? Where can we access all this great information? Is there a website? Do we contact the composers? Give us all the information.
Yeah, so most of the composers, actually, I believe all of the composers that I worked with, and by the way, I want just to backtrack slightly. I think to commission music, make sure that you like the music of the composers that you're working with. I feel like that's a really big thing that a lot of times we'll forego, just to try to get some content out there. But I think making sure that you really like the music is really, really helpful. Anyway, yeah, all my composers self-publish. I have all of their publishing or contact information in my dissertation. It's also on my website. I have a page titled Commissions, where all the music I've commissioned has links to recordings and where you can contact the composers to purchase the music. And I believe I have it listed in a bunch of different places, but also if you have the music or you know someone who has the music or you see it online somewhere, then you just reach out to the composers. They all self-publish, and they'll be able to get the music to you quickly. I believe it's all virtual. A lot of it's virtual now anyway, so easily accessible.
I know that I'll be recommending it for sure to a lot of people. Just wrapping up here, I got a couple of more questions. Are there any aspects, you're looking at this from a certain perspective. Are there any aspects of, new music, contemporary music, or the commissioning climate right now that you're really excited about? And or there's some things that you would like to see change in terms of, new music, the access, the composer performer collaborations?
Definitely. I am excited that something that excites me, I think, the most is that now there seems to be much less of a stigma on new music. New music is kind of cool. Like everybody wants to be doing new music, especially in academia. It seems like it's the new thing, even though it's not that new. I think something that and I think it's great that it's being incorporated more in pedagogy. Something that I definitely wish I had in retrospect. I'm grateful for my journey, for lack of a better word. But I definitely think it's amazing to see it being incorporated into pedagogy even earlier than what I grew up with. I think we still have a ways to go. I think a lot of new music, I think it needs to be made a little bit more accessible, and I hope we get a little closer to accessibility, both with regards to playing ability, and with, accessible to audiences who might not be familiar with classical music in general or clarinet repertoire. At its very core, if people don't like how music sounds, they're not going to want to come out to hear it. And I think that's something that the classical music world is struggling with in general. We hear this a lot about jazz, about how it's just like super weird. And so I think that what I definitely would like to see more of is music that's accessible for younger players, want to play and perform because it sounds cool and for the table, and something that more people of color, younger people, not even in new music. It's definitely, for lack of a better term, a boys club. You see a lot of the same names over and over again, and I'd like to see a lot of different names at the table, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense because, again, we're talking about, New Works Project, right? And I mentioned it, at the beginning. That's one of our main goals is featuring not only composers, but also the performers, hopefully, that are from diverse backgrounds, right? So we are talking about younger composers, like you mentioned, that hopefully would also direct pieces to the younger population of performers. We're also talking about, composers from all types of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. We're also talking about LGBTQ plus composers. We're also talking about, just basically representation, right? And that's really important because it is really something special to sort of almost see yourself in the music or see yourself from the perspective of another composer. And certainly that's something that I can identify with greatly, which is, by the way, as we wrap up, why once again I'm so excited about Luke Ellard's commission, the Clarinet Commission, which anybody can sign up. If you go to the New Works Project website, newworksproject.org, you can see a little bit about Luke Ellard. Registration fee is as low as $20 to be a part of a commission of a piece. And if you commit to performing the piece a certain amount of times, then you don't have to pay anything else. But there is a fee structure otherwise, which is, if you don't ever perform it, you pay this fee. But as you perform it, you get those programs in, then your cost goes down. And the reason is because the composer is now getting more performances, right? And more exposure. And that's how we increase, I think, the exposure and the diversity in the community. So thanks again for this. It's been a really great discussion. I want to let people know that the next digital communities will be September 11th with New Works Project.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, you froze a little bit there on my screen.
Okay.
For a minute. So I was just mentioning that our next New Works Project digital communities is September 11th with my fellow board member Devesh Karamchandani, and he's going to be talking with Brian Calhoun. And Brian and Devesh will talk about Brian's experience with voice and percussion and the Marimba Cabaret Project. So definitely check that out next month. But once again, just want to thank you all for joining us and watching this. If you did find today valuable at all, or you learned something, I hope you do consider supporting New Works Project by making a tax-deductible donation at newworksproject.org/donate. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Olivia Meadows, my friend and colleague. It was great to have you, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you for having me. It was so much fun talking with you about this, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.